switch.
Are we good? Just checking. Yes.
Yes, go
Okay.
ahead.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're logging on from today. I'm based in the California Bay Area, so it's still morning over here. Welcome to everyone who's joining us today from all around the country in different time zones. And we'll get started today in about a minute or so as we let people log in. Give it another 30 seconds. Great. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So aloha and welcome everyone to today's webinar on adopting a model tenant selection plan to create low barrier screening, best practices and learnings from multiple regions across the country. Just some quick housekeeping to get started. We will leave time at the end of today's webinar for Q&A with the panelists. If you have any questions today, please use the Q&A feature on your screen instead of the chat feature. We'll be monitoring both, but we'll first look at the questions submitted through the Q&A feature. So thank you. Also, we'd love to know who's joining us on today's webinar. So if you could add your name, what organization you work for, and what state you're joining us from in the chat, that would be great. Next slide, please. So my name is Kanani. Oh, one slide up. There you go. My name is Kanani Medeiros. I am the Associate Director of Justice Systems Transformation at CSH. In my role, I lead CSH's National Justice Portfolio. A big part of that work is focused on eliminating and reducing housing access barriers and increasing support for people with justice system involvement through state and federal advocacy, policy, and system interventions. My work also includes scaling CSH key justice initiatives and working with our state regional teams and national staff from across the country and advancing other areas of our justice portfolio, like the work you'll hear about today. So next slide, please. And for those unfamiliar with the Corporation for Supportive Housing, most often referred to as CSH, we are a national nonprofit intermediary and community development financial institution that advances affordable and accessible housing aligned with services, and we accomplish our work by advocating for effective policies and funding, equitable investing in communities, and strengthening the supportive housing field. And at its core, CSH strives to make meaningful improvements in the lives of individuals and families by catalyzing change at both the community and system level. And so before moving forward, go back. I would like to acknowledge and thank our funder, Capital One, for the continued support in this important work to increase access to housing for people with justice system involvement. Next slide, please. So here's the agenda today, and just highlight CSH's work in supportive housing has shown repeatedly that people with incarceration histories can be successful tenants when connected with appropriate housing and services. However, use of background checks and over-restricted policies by housing providers in determining eligibility has risen dramatically in recent decades, making the problem worse and contributing to housing instability. And with that, we are here today to talk about equity and tenant screening. Today's webinar builds off two webinars we did in 2022 and 2023, where we conducted a landscape assessment and learning collaborative comprised of housing providers to better understand the trends in criminal background screening and tenant selection procedures in Virginia, which later informed the creation of several tools, including a model tenant selection plan to help reduce barriers to housing for people with justice system involvement. And for those who are interested in the content and the associated tools we develop, we'll share the link to them in the chat. And today's discussion centers on the work that we have currently been doing to continue moving our efforts forward by amplifying these resources, learnings, and best practices throughout Virginia, including new regions like Michigan and Nevada. Today's webinar, you will learn more about this work and how we can create alternative screening methods that promote equity and better serve people with justice system involvement, including hearing from our CSH Indiana colleagues and friends at the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority, and the amazing work they are doing around low barrier screening in Indiana. So all this work has been focused on these regions, but it can be applied to communities across the country. So with that, I want to again welcome and thank you for joining us today. And I will now pass it on to my colleague at CSH, Shiri Yadalin, to introduce herself and kick us off with some level setting to discuss the work in Virginia.
Thanks so much, Kanani. Hi, everybody. Really good to be with you all today. You can go back to that previous slide, actually. I'm going to introduce myself first before we get into some of this content. My name is Shiri Yadlin. I am part of the Mid-Atlantic team at CSH. We do work in DC, Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware. So I saw lots of folks in the chat introducing themselves from the Mid-Atlantic region. Good to get to know you. I am based in Washington, DC, and I'm going to speak a little bit about some of just the context, why we care about this at CSH, and then share a bit about the work we've done in Virginia before I pass it on to my colleagues in other regions. And the reason why we're showcasing the work we've done with kind of justice-involved populations and housing in a lot of different places is because we want to show kind of the range of strategies that our different teams are using to address this same challenge, which is that folks who have justice system involvement often are locked out of housing opportunities. And so we're going to showcase a lot of different ways that our teams are working with partners to address that issue in the hopes that it will encourage and inspire you all to do that same work in your communities with whatever strategy you think makes the most sense for your context. We also know that there's lots of folks on the call today who are doing this work. And so we're excited to hear about that work and kind of lessons learned from you all as well, because we're all doing this work together. So please do use that Q&A and we'll make sure we have time at the end. So when we're talking about justice-involved populations and access to housing, we're talking about people who have had some kind of interaction with the justice system or the legal system or the carceral system. And that's a lot of people. That includes jails, it includes prison, it includes youth incarceration, supervision. And as you can see on this graphic on the screen, we're talking about a lot of people, right? We're talking about millions of people. In the United States, there's an estimated 70 to 100 million people who have some kind of conviction history, and there's almost 2 million people who are currently incarcerated, according to the Prison Policy Initiative, which is a great resource for data that you can go to the Prison Policy Initiative website, and there's data specifically for your state if you're interested in what it looks like a little closer to home. But kind of the bottom line is when we're talking about justice-involved populations, justice-involved individuals, we are talking about a lot of people. So these issues we're talking about today impact a lot of people. We can go to the next slide. And not only is the population with justice involvement a large population, it's also a very lopsided population when it comes to representation of people from different race and ethnic backgrounds. Like many other systems that we're aware of, there is significant racial inequity in justice involvement. And so when we tie housing outcomes to justice involvement, we're just perpetuating and expanding those existing inequities. So on the screen here is a graphic that we often talk about at CSH. This comes from our Racial Disparities and Disproportionalities Index data set. You can explore that more on our data page, csh.org/data. But what this is showing is the likelihood of one group experiencing jail or prison compared to the likelihood of another group experiencing jail or prison. So each number here is a ratio that compares one group to the aggregate of all the other groups. So For example, the blue bar shows that people in America who are Black have higher likelihoods of being involved in the justice system than any other group. And the same is true for American Indian, Alaskan Native populations, although to a lesser extent. And then on the other hand, white communities in America have on average are less likely to experience interaction with the justice system. So, to get a little more specific, we see here that Black youth in the United States are almost 6 times more likely to experience the justice system as anyone else, whereas youth who are white are only a quarter as likely. So, we share this because, it's important to note that these ratios are not about propensity for members of a certain group to go to jail or prison. It doesn't say anything about the characteristics of individuals within these different racial or ethnic groups. It's about the systems we're dealing with. This graphic is a demonstration of population inequities within these systems, demonstrating the disproportionate representation of, in this case, Black populations within the justice system, and then simultaneously the underrepresentation of other groups. This is a national average. Again, there's data specific for each state if you're interested in looking at that. And just want to emphasize this because, again, when we are tying housing outcomes or housing opportunities to justice system involvement, or excluding folks with certain justice involvement from housing opportunities, we are perpetuating the inequalities that exist. I see that there's a question in the chat that I'll respond to really quickly. The methodology for all of this study is you can visit csh.org/data and learn about how this was all calculated. Okay, we can go to the next slide. And for the most part, we're going to answer questions at the end. I just wanted to touch on that one real quick because I saw it. So, there's real implications for people who have justice system involvement when it comes to finding stable housing in the future. We know that people who have been incarcerated are 10 times more likely to experience homelessness than the general population, in part because of some of the barriers folks face when trying to find housing, which, we'll talk about a lot more today. And so when housing providers place background screening barriers in place for their properties, often folks are citing, public safety, right? There's this kind of idea that if we are screening out people who have convictions on their record, then it keeps our community safer. But the reality is, stable housing is a critical piece of public safety. It's better for public safety as a whole when we ensure that people have safe and stable housing. You can see some of the statistics on the screen. People who are unhoused are more likely to interact with police, more likely to be arrested. Housing instability increases the odds of recidivism, but stable housing decreases the odds of recidivism. And we know that stable housing can aid in recovery for lots of different kinds of people. And so really want to kind of a big piece of this work, as you'll hear repeatedly throughout our conversation today, is just shifting this kind of the narrative that we, I think, as a society have continued to perpetuate, that this misguided idea that having people who have conviction records in a community is inherently dangerous for the community, when in reality it's unstable housing and homelessness that's the real danger to a community. So and locking people out of opportunities for stable housing. So let's go to the next slide. With that kind of level setting, wanted to transition us into a conversation about kind of what CSH is doing in response to these realities. Our work incorporates a variety of strategies, and we're going to share them with you today, as I said, to maybe showcase all the different ways that we can be trying to move the needle to lower screening barriers for people who have been incarcerated. So I'm going to begin with talking about my team's work in Virginia. In 2021, our team did a series of focus groups to understand the state of the need for supportive housing in Virginia. And a clear theme across all of those groups was that background screening was making it impossible for a lot of people in Virginia who needed supportive housing to be able to actually access it. This was cited as one of the largest barriers to housing, regardless of what the subpopulation was that was in the focus group. And this led us to want to understand the problem better so that we could strategize how to address it alongside other partners in the justice space. Now, we know that the Housing Finance Agency in Virginia, Virginia Housing, had put out some guidance around these issues. There was movement around these issues, but we wanted to really understand it. And so in 2022, we conducted this landscape assessment, which was research where we were trying to better understand what do background screenings actually look like in Virginia? Kind of what's the baseline? What are properties? What specific convictions are they looking for? What are the processes that they use? So we analyzed over 120 tenant selection plans from every part of the state, big developments, small developments, private landlords, big companies. And we also interviewed a lot of people who were trying to access housing. And we really identified a whole bunch of trends and themes in all these plans, kind of interested in what some of these biggest barriers were. Go to the next slide. I'll tell you a little bit about what we found in that research. So this landscape assessment taught us that there were some things that properties were doing really well. So for example, they were not screening people out for traffic violations. They were focusing on only convictions, not arrests. For the most part, like there were some processes that these properties were doing well on. However, there were also some spaces where there were some small changes, that could be made that really would have a big impact. So one example is look back periods. We saw that there were a lot of properties who were screening people out for convictions that were 10 plus years old, or they were screening people out for small convictions, for things, public nuisance convictions. So those are things like maybe loitering or trespassing, or often crimes that are often associated with homelessness. So someone who had been convicted of trespassing 7 years ago, that would screen someone out. So, by shortening look back periods, by removing public nuisance convictions, and by adjusting how some of the drug and marijuana charges were addressed, it would open the door to a lot more people accessing housing. There was a lot of things that were kind of unrelated to someone's actual ability to maintain the terms of their lease that were being used to screen folks out. So we kind of identified a bunch of best practices and some changes that could be made that we thought would make a big difference in terms of screening people in. But we wanted to not just come up with these ideas. We wanted to share them back with the property management community to just get their feedback and find out, like, what do you think about these ideas? What are your barriers to implementing them? So we had a conversation with property managers. We can go to the next slide. I'll tell you a bit about what that property management dialogue looked like. So it was really enlightening. We shared these results and talked with them about the ideas. And we heard a couple of really clear messages from those conversations. And one is that property managers really wanted to talk about this. They wanted to learn about it. They were interested in the topic. And in many cases, they were open to conversations. They just didn't really know where to start. They were worried about some of the, common themes that come up around public safety and things like that. They were looking for tools and resources. They wanted help in doing this. And so that led us to kind of our next phase of work, which was putting together resources for property managers. And I'm going to pause for a second, see this question in the chat. The landscape assessment, the question is what kind of properties were included in the landscape assessment? And the answer is all. So it was not just supportive housing. It was a lot of different affordable housing, private developments, LIHTC developments, and others as well. So it's pretty broad range. Go to the next slide. I'll tell you about a couple of these resources we put out. So, and Kanani mentioned, we put in the chat a website that has a bunch of these resources. The main one that we put together was this model tenant screening process. And our goal with this was to make it as easy as possible for housing providers to make a change by providing a pretty fillable template, an adaptable template that folks could use that incorporates best practices and robust research into what actually matters when evaluating someone's suitability for tenancy. I'm not going to talk in great detail about this process. We did a webinar on it last year, so happy to connect you to the details there. And the link to the actual resource is in the chat right now. But this was one thing we put together as a resource to support housing providers in actually implementing lower barrier screenings. And go to the next slide. we also put together a frequently asked questions document, to accompany this model screening process that really tries to address a lot of the common concerns and fears that come up when we introduce this template and this lower barrier screening process. Questions like, how does this connect with fair housing? Or, doesn't HUD say I have to do a background screening? Or what about public safety? We tried to answer these questions with a lot of research as a way to both make it easier to incorporate a lower barrier screening and to kind of equip people with the language to use to address community concerns that come up around low barrier screening. So lots of resources, and I'm going over these pretty quickly because we just want to kind of make you aware of what's out there and the way that our team in Virginia has approached this work. We kind of saw that we have a lot of relationships with property owners, with landlords, and thought that a more kind of relational and almost like grassroots approach to this issue with collaborative learning cohorts and presentations at conferences and informal relational conversations with people in this space, that would be a way for us to move the needle in this. And as you'll hear from other folks, our colleagues in other parts of the country have taken different approaches, and we think that all of these approaches are really important. So with that, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Lindsay, to share a bit more about the approach that Lindsay's team has taken in Michigan to address the same issues. And I'll be back later to continue answering your questions. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them into that Q&A at the bottom of your screen. You'll find it on the bottom, kind of next to the mute buttons. You'll see a box that says Q&A, and you can put your questions there. So Lindsay, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Sherry. Hi, everybody. So excited to be with you today. I'm Lindsay Bishop Gilmore. Pronouns are she, her. I am a senior program manager here at Michigan. I work on our Michigan team. I am based in the city of Detroit. And I'm excited to share some of the work that we're doing in Michigan. And all of this is at a very high level to highlight the different approaches that we are taking to really think about how can we best connect and provide housing and also connecting the services as well. So I'm going to touch on a few kind of different approaches. So the first is we've worked really closely with our state housing finance agency, who is also the state's largest public housing authority, Michigan State Housing Development Authority, on their housing choice voucher program. And so they have around 25,000 vouchers that are tenant-based and project-based as well. And over the years, this did not happen in 1 year or 2 years or 5 years, but we've really worked closely with them to think about how can we reduce the barriers and the screening criteria that's in place to align more with the federal kind of HUD expectation and the minimum screening criteria. It's not quite there yet, but there's been a lot of progress that's been made. Additionally, with the tenant-based vouchers, MSHA across the entire state has created a homeless preference, which has led to a lot of people that have experienced homelessness, many of which have had some involvement with the criminal justice system, to be able to access resources in a way that they hadn't been before the housing preference that happened several years ago. One of the things that we're starting to do more is look really closely at the data around that. A lot of people are being connected with housing. A lot of people are staying stably housed. But where can we make improvements in the process? And so we see right now that a lot of people are being selected for a voucher, but are falling off sometime throughout the process. And sometimes that's because people feel like they're not going to be able to pass the criminal screening criteria. And so how do we communicate more transparently about what that screening criteria is so people don't automatically kind of drop out of the process? And similar to the tenant-based, MSHA also uses project-based vouchers in their supportive housing developments, which has also really focused around reducing barriers there as well, and incentivizing that within those supportive housing developments. The second kind of key area has been a couple of years ago, MSHA engaged in a can't remember the name of it, but a process to look at all of their policies that they have developed related to housing, allocating their housing resources and looking at it through a racial equity lens. And one of the things that came out of that and the recommendation that came out of that was having a more inclusive tenant selection plan. And so when the most recent qualified allocation plan was created, having an inclusive tenant selection plan with low barrier screening that aligns with MISHDA's low barrier screening project points for that. So it's not a requirement, and this is just for affordable housing units. It's not a requirement, but projects, are being incentivized with points. It has been a requirement for supportive housing developments that have been funded under the low income housing tax credit. Over the last, I think 5 years, MISHDA has had a unique partnership with the Michigan Department of Corrections, where they have allocated a small amount of vouchers to people that are exiting the justice system in Michigan that will be experiencing homelessness and have a disability, and connecting them with housing choice vouchers. Again, using the least restrictive screening criteria as possible. And we have a lot of incredible data regarding that around recidivism. We know based on that data as of last year that less than 6% of those folks that have used those vouchers have had some sort of recidivism within the justice system. And so we've seen a real incredible ability for people to access housing, to stay housed, but then also not re-enter the criminal justice system as well. And then the other kind of thing that I want to highlight is there's been a lot of work in Michigan across a variety of partners to really center tenant protection bills. And we've worked with national partners and local partners. And CSH is just a small part of this work, but really, how do we create a process that is more standard across the state? We, like many other states, have so many different public housing authorities with a variety of screening criterias. And so how do we use bills and legislation to set some consistent screening criteria that people can understand, and that we can provide kind of training and compliance around as well. So we can go into the next slide. So some of the things, those are high levels, but some of the things that we are working on getting intentional about. In Michigan, we feel like we've done an incredible job at creating and leveraging a lot of different housing resources for supportive housing, and ensuring that people that are exiting the justice system and that have criminal histories can access that housing as well. So we have the housing resources. There's a few things that we know that we need to get really intentional about. And the first is around capacity building and education. We've done a lot of work in partnership with our housing finance agency that allocates housing resources. A lot of now our to happen one-on-one with some of our large property management companies in the state, and some of the smaller kind of landlords as well. And so how can we do that education building? Also really starting to address some of the myths that Shiri talked about as well, and we have so much data that we can be using to kind of tell the story about what we know, the impact that housing can have, the impact that reducing screening criteria can have for folks. And then really also looking at equitable use of resources, looking at our state. Are the resources being distributed equitably, ensuring that we're also looking at the racial makeup of the state as well, to really think about who's been most impacted by the criminal justice system and mass incarceration, and ensure that we're targeting those resources appropriately. And then the last thing that's not on this slide is, the focus has really been around housing. We are pushing, I think as other communities are as well, to really focus on the supportive service funding to make sure that people, as they're kind of re-entering their communities and moving into their housing, that they have the supports to really navigate a really complex world, that probably includes a lot of trauma associated with it, and just support people. And so that's another piece where we're really doubling down our work, that we can pair all of these kind of activities to reduce barriers and also make sure that people can stay adequately housed. I think I stayed under 5 minutes, which was my hope. With that, I'm gonna turn it over to Brooke.
Great. Thank you so much, Lindsay. Such great work happening in Michigan. Hi, everyone. My name is Brooke Page. I'm the director for the Southwest programs here at CSH. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm happy to elevate CSH's work that's happening here in my home state of Nevada. Although the Southwest, we cover Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, Utah, and Arizona. So for the folks here on the call who are from those states, if this is work that you're interested in, please feel free to reach out. On the next slide, how we've kind of taken this approach is similar to how Sherry has started this conversation. In Nevada, we are considered an emerging market because we don't have a lot of housing dedicated for extremely low income people, people who have complex barriers to housing, of which the population of folks that are with justice involvement is really an important population that we are trying to educate our elected officials, educate our service providers and community-based organizations that this is an important intervention that can help us address the needs in so many different areas. And so to do that, we've been building the case. And part of our way of building the case is educating on the need. CSH has been put in the chat, has our supportive housing needs assessment that provides data across all the states across the country. In Nevada, we have almost 7,000 people that need supportive housing, but the niche of the folks that need this intervention who have justice involvement is about 40% of that population. And so putting that notice on folks that, we really need to be considering how we approach this issue very differently, data really helps us make that argument. And so on the next slide, Sherry also illuminated the racial disparities utilizing CSH's racial disparities and disproportionality index. This is the data for Nevada specifically. So when you pull this report for your state, you can kind of see how this looks in 16 different sectors. But the likelihood of Black people in the justice, prison, and jail system is definitely disproportionate to other racial groups. And those wait lists are very high and the folks that are involved in these systems are very high. Specific to the justice involved population. So we use this also to talk about the need to address this approach from a racial equity frame as well. On the next slide, when we talk about data, we can't talk about this as a silo. So we've been educating our elected officials and community members about the juxtaposition of these barriers that folks are up against in the context of an economy where we've got rent rising higher than the cost of housing. Housing costs rising faster than folks' incomes are rising. And so that disproportionate issue is also creating inequities in our communities and causing folks to become homeless in a lot of ways. And so we have to talk about this in a multi-dynamic approach, talking about housing costs, talking about stagnant wages, talking about the lack of affordable housing and the lack of housing stock in Nevada specifically, where we don't have enough housing stock to address this need. And so if we aren't giving folks the tools and the resources to be successful, we're going to have the challenges that we face. And so we also talk about inadequate funding for services and the need to ensure that we've got the right wraparound supports for folks to have tenancy supports and tenancy sustaining services. And we address the racial inequities. And so these tenant selection plans, we find that are disproportionately impacting certain racial groups more than others. Those are conversations that we have to be having and bringing those conversations forward. And so we are leveraging the tenant selection plan as a tool to talk about what part of these policies are necessary and what part of them can be changed. And the NIMBYism and the not in my backyard and the community folks in our communities who are uneducated or are thinking about these tenant selection plans as tools to increase safety, when they're actually causing more harm in a lot of ways. So those are sort of the tools that we use to get to the table and have conversations. The next slide are some of the tables that we've set in Nevada. We've done some education leveraging our partners with the Nevada Housing Coalition. The coalition has been really important to increase capacity throughout the state. And so Elevate Nevada has been a capacity building resource and education tool that we've used to educate on supportive housing generally. And then we've also drilled down to kind of have certain subpopulation conversations utilizing these the coalition as a tool to help us. And in addition to that, we've also done, we have the Interagency Council on Homelessness to Housing that has a technical assistance work group that is actually identifying an action plan that has various different goals and strategic issues that they are focusing on, one of which is housing. And in that housing plan, there is a goal to create a standardized tenant selection plan that is low barrier. And so we are developing what that policy should be in order to present that to our housing finance agency and our various different property managers across the state in order to advocate for low barrier tenant selection plans. We also are doing myth busting on funding sources. There's a lot of folks that are creating more policies than necessary using certain fund sources. And so we're doing some education with our local jurisdictions to encourage them not to create more barriers than are necessary, especially in new fund sources like Home ARP and some other different tools. And then lastly, we're taking what we're learning and we're going to create a written report on how to create housing for people with justice involvement as a white paper to educate and to be a lasting document that can be leveraged for the various different legislative sessions and for our community members. So that way we can hold folks accountable to this work. So thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it back to Sherry.
Thank you, Brooke. Really great work being done in Nevada. Thank you, Lindsay, for talking about the work in Michigan. I think it's exciting to see some themes across these different regions, kind of use of data, a lot of myth busting involved, kind of leveraging existing relationships to do work in this space. And so looking forward to seeing how this work progresses in both Nevada and Michigan and other parts of your region. So our sort of last group of speakers is from Indiana. And so I'm excited to introduce you to Leah Hicks, who's my colleague in CSH in Indiana, and then Zach Gross and Matt Rayburn with the Indiana Housing and Community Development Agency. So they will introduce themselves, and then I'll be asking some questions to have a conversation about what this work looks like in Indiana. So Leah, why don't you start, you introduce yourself first, and then we'll have Matt and Zach go.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Sherry. Yes, as Sherry mentioned, I'm Leah Hicks, and I work out of our CSH Indiana office and based in Indianapolis. And excited to be talking with you today with my colleagues, Matt and Zach. So I'll hand it over to Matt.
All right, thanks, Leah. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Rayburn. I am the Deputy Executive Director and Chief Real Estate Development Officer at IHCDA. We are the State Housing Finance Authority for the state of Indiana. We are also a balance of state public housing agency and involved with our balance of state continuum of care. I have the privilege of overseeing all of the agency's capital funding programs, as well as a good number of our rental assistance programs and our supportive housing efforts. And I'll pass it off to Zach on my team.
Hey everyone, I'm Zach Gross. I'm the Supportive Housing Manager at IHCDA, and I manage our supportive housing initiatives and our justice-involved housing work, including our reentry programs and our work for low barrier tenant selection.
Wonderful. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm really excited for you all to share about the work you're doing in Indiana. If you could start by just telling us about what does the partnership look like between CSH and the department?
Yeah, I mean, I'll get us started and say that we were really fortunate to have a really long-standing relationship over 16 years that IHCDA and CSH have been working together and collaborating on different initiatives, very much so around our Supportive Housing Institute. So in Indiana, we've had 16 years of Supportive Housing Institutes and really pushing forward the opportunity to both develop supportive housing, but then provide that ongoing training and technical assistance to those operational developments. And so we work really close together on providing that TA and being able to provide the training and doing that together. Our agencies working together to develop and co-train. And I think that's important because we're sending that message from, I think both sides, from CSH as a collaborator and that intermediary that's providing best practices and the supports, but you have IHCDA that sometimes has the funding mechanisms, but also is saying, hey, we're aligned with this, and we also want the work we're doing and the funding that we're providing to be aligned. And so hearing it from those two different places in one voice, I think elevates and amplifies the work we're doing collaboratively. So there's some other things on the slide there that you see that we also do supportive housing around persons with IDD and TBI. That's set aside within the QAP, and some other housing or supportive housing and affordable housing initiatives. So I'll see if Matt and Zach want to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. I don't think a ton to add here. Would just reiterate that I think we've had a very, very productive relationship between us as the HFA and CSH as kind of our preferred TA provider, but also a great thought leader for the state of Indiana. So our work goes back to 2007, 2008 timeframe when we launched, decided to do the first Supportive Housing Institute. Really our first almost 10 years together was exclusively focused on supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness. But really over the last 6 or 7 years, IHCDA and CSH have worked together to develop programming and policies on how do we take those lessons learned that have worked so well in that model and expand to other populations that can benefit from supportive services, from low barrier practices, et cetera. So as Leah quickly mentioned, now for about 7 years, we've been working together to create integrated supportive housing units for people with intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, and traumatic brain injury that uses those same model of low barrier, kind of a housing first approach. And then we've also done a lot of discussions around justice involvement and reentry type initiatives, including some upcoming work we'll be doing together on some programs Zach will likely talk about later with some DOJ grants that we've been excited to receive this year. So it's been a great relationship. And I think the key is that, our goal is to keep taking what we have learned and expand beyond supportive housing. So when developers, property managers, different people first heard about our work we were doing with CSH, they thought, oh, that's a unique thing that's over here that's only in this very kind of niche bucket of supportive housing. But what we've really been doing is saying, now that we see it can work in affordable housing, we're expanding it out beyond. So things about low barrier, things about kind of voluntary service models and kind of all these principles we've used in supportive housing have been kind of creeping their way over the last few years into our broader policy approaches and certainly being incentivized kind of at large through the QAP.
That's great. I think it's really special to see such a long relationship and one that continues to evolve to meet kind of the evolving needs of the community in Indiana. And I'm curious, why low barrier screening? Why is that something that's important to you all, that you have dedicated, specific staff people to and a lot of resources to? Like, why is low barrier screening important to you all at IHCDA?
Yeah, I think, low barrier screening is, you look at the data and see, that people are excluded from housing for reasons that don't impact their ability to be a good tenant or the safety of the property. And I think from us looking at it from a supportive housing lens for so long, it really did just kind of, why not? Like it just kind of brought up, like, why wouldn't we, try to incentivize this in our other programming and expand this knowledge set? We have a lot of partners that have done a really good job in supportive housing environments of operating low barrier housing and not screening for, for most criminal offenses, and have had pretty successful programs. So why not amplify those voices and, share that messaging with the rest of the state and other programs and developers and property managers who are operating affordable housing or even market rate housing, to say, you can do this too. Here's best practices. And, at the same time we were looking at this, we were, getting asked by our Indiana Department of Correction to, what kind of things can IHCDA do to support this population and help these folks get more access to housing, because we know they don't have a lot of access to housing, and that it increases likelihood for homelessness and recidivism and all these other things. So I think, coming at it from that lens and looking at our work in supportive housing. And I'll say one more thing is that we do have justice involved housing programs as well. So we've been running those for quite a while too. And the main one that we have there is a tenant-based rental assistance program paid for out of the federal home program, to provide rental assistance, temporary up to 2 years, for households who have at least one member who is formerly incarcerated, and is either experiencing homelessness or currently exiting incarceration. And so we've been operating that for about 7 years or so. And, that's been a great program, and it's been so useful for people to, get back on their feet and to find stable housing and get stable in the community and access the needed services that they're eligible for. They just need, some help getting connected to them. And we've seen, really, really good success with that. So looking at that, how well that's worked, and the barriers that those households face in finding units, because it's tenant-based rental assistance. So they're looking for, units in the community. And then looking at our supportive housing work, I think it was just a natural progression for us to say, how can we at least, be sending these messaging out? So we started this by just communicating in webinars and just talking to people about, hey, this is an option. You can do low barrier screening. You can do individualized assessments. That's not a violation of fair housing. HUD encourages it. There's a lot of, good material out there about that right now. So if you want to do it, you can do it. And, no, we didn't have a ton of pushback. There were some people reach out to us who we didn't even know were doing this, that were saying, oh yeah, we really like that model. And so we decided, to, of course, take the next step and continue expanding this work and incentivizing it through programs.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add there is that gave a great answer, but if I could summarize the initial question, right, of why as an HFA did we want to get into low barrier screening, I think I'd summarize it in 4 quick bullet points. And I think the first is more of the mission side, right? So I would just say it's the right thing for us to do, from a mission standpoint, from a human standpoint, from an equity standpoint. So it just ties so well into our mission and kind of our philosophy. Secondarily, I would say the data supports it. We have seen through our years of doing supportive housing on the homelessness side that this model works. People get in, they stay stably housed. So this has not been a failure of a model, quite the opposite. Tying into what I would say is the third bullet point, right? This is evidence-based, both with national data as well as once we had that kind of critical mass of supportive housing and live projects in Indiana using this model, we can run our own data and say this is evidence-based based on what is working in our own portfolio. And then finally, I think I would say, I think we kind of took it on as a, if not us, who, right? Who else in the state is positioned to take this stance and really drive developer and property manager behavior in the same way that the HFA is? And I think that is a unique role that we have, and maybe it's a bit of a bully pulpit, but as the creators of these QAP scoring incentives, et cetera, we really have a unique ability to drive behavior on the development and management side. And we want to use that tool to promote the mission.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think there are definitely other representatives of housing finance agencies or other funders who are in the audience today. And, you all do have a lot of power in that role that you have. And so love to hear you just, deciding to do something with that power that is, you said, data supported and evidence-based. I want to encourage folks, if they have questions, to put them in the Q&A box. You can find it on the bottom of your screen. There's a little kind of chat bubble with the question mark in it that says Q&A. You can use that to ask your questions, and we'll come around to questions at the end in about 10 or 15 minutes. So you mentioned, thanks for going to the next slide, appreciate it. We one of your responsibilities as IHCDA is to create the QAP, the Qualified Allocation Plan. For those who are not familiar, it's the sort of set of governing guidelines that determine sort of who gets access to tax credits and other kinds of financing. Every state has one, and if you aren't familiar with what's in your QAP, it is something to look at to try to understand kind of what the priorities are for funding of affordable housing in the state or region that you live in. So if you all could tell us, you've made a lot of updates to your QAP to specifically incentivize low barrier screening. So can you share a bit about that and specifically the changes you've made? Yeah.
Yeah, I can dive in first, and then Zach, please chime in. So I guess to back up though, right, when we're talking about true supportive housing, whether that is on a population coming off of coordinated entry who's experiencing homelessness, or whether it's our IDD, traumatic brain injury work, for our supportive housing projects, they do not have an option. All of our supportive housing resources, we mandate that they use low barrier screening. So our incentive points are for just traditional either family or age restricted affordable housing that is not actually otherwise operating under a supportive housing model. So this is really our attempt to just get all of our affordable housing developers and owner agents using this model. So in our current QAP, and some people might say, oh, this is only 2 points, that seems small. A lot of our scoring categories are really only like 2 to 4 points. And in our system, often the difference of a fraction of a point can get someone funded or not. So a 2-point category is not insignificant in the Indiana system. Obviously, in another QAP, that might be too small and would need to be weighted. But in our weighting system, this matters. So there are 2 points here. The first point is if you agree that you will not screen for misdemeanor convictions at all. And then the second point is for felony screenings, you cannot look back farther than 5 years. And within that 5-year look back, we only allow owner agents to look at violent crimes, arson, or manufacturing methamphetamine. Now, in that screening, they would still have to do an individualized assessment, so it's not an automatic denial. The only thing we would allow an owner to set up as an automatic denial is registered sex offenders, and if it's certain HUD, project-based voucher funding, we know they have to use the HUD rule of if you manufactured methamphetamine in public housing, you have to be excluded. Now, we understand that the lifetime sex offender registry becomes an issue because individuals continue to be screened out. That is not to say we're not sympathetic to that population and that we don't see that contributing to ongoing housing instability. We know the political realities here, and we know that as we are pushing developers, this is not an area we have forced yet, although it is an issue we are, I think, continuing to explore on how can we try to ensure that population can find housing somewhere. So this is the start of it. I think we've got another slide in a moment that talks about, we also look at kind of some eviction screening. Yeah, so part of it is low barrier on the criminal side, and then there's a separate scoring category that tries to discourage owner agents from screening out individuals based on eviction histories. We've actually had this in the QAP now since 2022. So you get 1 point if you agree to not look at any evictions older than 12 months, and it goes up to be 2 points if you don't look at any eviction history older than 6 months. So these two categories together, the low barrier eviction screening, the low barrier criminal screening, comes out to a total of 4 possible points, and both of them say this is required for PSH, so it's basically automatic points for supportive housing developments, and both of them do require a commitment to do individualized assessments.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I think Matt did a really good job of covering just the structure of the policy and what we look at. We've also developed some tools for our developer community to use, and in some cases have to use when implementing some of these policies. So on the screening for criminal history, we've put together a guide for doing an individualized assessment. So the most of the questions that we get in terms of actually putting this into practice is, how do you do an individualized assessment? What does that look like? how does any of this screening work in practice? So we try to be very clear that what we mean when we say you're screening for a felony that's, within that 5-year period, is that we want to see in that plan, and we have, stipulations in the policy that we will have to review that plan, that we want to see that you're being very clear about what the actual convictions are that are going to be, caught in that screening or be flagged, which you're going to look at. So just saying, screening for a violent crime in the tenant selection plan isn't sufficient. You have to actually spell out what that means. If it's assault, battery, murder, whatever, those have to be identified. And then when those things, if it's something that doesn't fall under those categories, if it's, if somebody has convictions that don't meet those, then you shouldn't be looking at them at all. And those should not factor into that assessment. If somebody does have those, one of those, and it flags on your screening, then that's when it triggers an individualized assessment piece. And the biggest part of that, I think, and to me, the most critical part of the individualized assessment is it requires that you allow the applicant to provide mitigating information to support their application for tenancy. And really, it's on the property to determine, whether that person's history, whether what they have submitted is sufficient to say that they do not pose a threat to the property, to other residents, or to staff. And if you can't say that there's a real danger to the property, other residents, or staff, then there's no reason to deny that person access to the property. And so that's the framing for that, and that's what those tools lay out. On the eviction prevention side of things, we require properties that are elect to receive those points have eviction prevention plans that will eliminate what they can evict for, or include as guidelines to how they process evictions, lease violations, et cetera.
Thanks for that. And Leah has put in the chat a link to see those resources. I know that individualized assessment tool, I would agree, is a really, really useful one. That's something that comes up for us in Virginia a lot anytime we talk about just the importance of an individualized assessment. And it's really, the way you laid that out is really consistent with also HUD's fair housing guidance, saying that, you need to have a clear reason as to why this terms of denial is relevant to someone's ability to maintain the terms of their lease. And so kind of a lot of times, I think when the idea of an individualized assessment is out there, there's this fear that, oh no, that could like inject bias, that could lead us to discrimination. But in reality, it's actually a less discriminatory alternative to just a blanket like checkbox screening.
Yeah, I think oh, go ahead, Zach.
I was just going to say, I think that's a really important point. And in looking at tenant selection plans for the last several years now, I think people aren't necessarily always consistent, even with that HUD guidance from 2016. And, in looking at why are you screening out for these things? So, I mean, if you can't respond to that question and have a good sense of what the actual danger is, then you shouldn't be including those things in your screening. And so that happens a lot. We'll see somebody screening out for like a DUI, for instance. I'm not saying it's good to have a DUI, of course not. But what's the threat to the property if somebody has that conviction? If they have one conviction for a DUI 3 years ago? Is there a real threat to the property? If you can't answer that question, then what's it doing in your tenant selection plan? And I think that there's this kind of sort of and maybe that's not an intentional bias or something that's even thought out. It's just when you're putting together these plans, I think it's just an assumption on some people that haven't had exposure to this information or really thought about doing things a different way, that you have to screen out for all these things, and that's just the way you do it. And you're looking for the best possible tenants, and the best possible tenants don't have all of these conviction histories.
Yeah, I think the point that's been made here that I want to reiterate is that this concept of low barrier and an individualized assessment, while we're kind of presenting it as a maybe optional or something you should get points for. To some degree, it really is essentially mandatory to comply with fair housing since 2016, right? Now, we are pushing farther than that HUD guidance would require, but the reality is 2016 HUD guidance, which has been expanded in April 2024 with an additional HUD guidance on resident screening, really tells us, right? This wasn't a concept IHCDA created. Individualized assessment is HUD language to say if we want to avoid fair housing violations based on a disparate impact, we need to give people the opportunity to explain mitigating situations. We need to look at their whole history, not just click a button on a screening tool and then move on. And what I really like about the 2024 guidance that just came out this April is it really lays out the fact that it is not enough for an owner agent to say, well, I have bought a third-party system that I run your name through, and it told me I should deny you, right? So the new HUD guidance is very crystal clear that that's not a defense for the owner. The owner is still the human being who needs to make a decision on, is this individual really problematic to move into my property or not? So it makes it very clear that it's not a defensible response to say, I denied Matt. Well, why? Well, because the software system I use told me to, when the reality is those software systems are not immune from making mistakes. They are increasingly more and more just AI generated, not a person on the other end really scrubbing and making sure that things are correct. And to Zach's point, right, if you bought an off-the-shelf screening system or subscription, didn't look at what was set up in that screening, it might be screening out on all types of things like the DUI that you don't even back up in your tenant selection plan and say that you're screening for. So this guidance is very important to look at and understand that owner agents can be found liable for fair housing violations for over reliance on these third-party systems. So you really need to know what those systems are screening for. Does it match your tenant selection? How are you customizing that system to match your policies?
Great.
Yeah, and I think to go along with both what Matt and Zach have said, and going and working one-on-one with teams and properties, and talking with them about their plans, as Zach said, speaking to, well, why is this in your plan? And that it's been there. Well, it's been there as long as I know, and it ties back to Sherry when one of your slides earlier on about sort of these myths and things. One of the other things we know is that this type of practice in property management hasn't been a forever thing, right? It's only happened really in the last 20 or 30 years in the professionalism of the property management work. And so really being able to have these conversations and take pause and say, oh, let's figure out why we're doing this, and that we really do have the space to do something different, has been really helpful in these conversations. The education, but then that one-on-one of, okay, let's talk about what you are comfortable with, or how we get there. So that it pairs well with taking the guidance and the education, the HUD guidance, all of those things, but then let's distill that for you.
Yeah. I think it's a really also just a special place that you all are in, where you have sort of the state agency policy making, or kind of administrative policy making power, and then also the kind of community technical assistance provider being able to work on these things together, and kind of address the issues together as true partners. And so kind of as we're kind of wrapping up and going to move into the Q&A session in a bit, kind of what advice do you have either for other funders who are, in the position to be able to make some adjustments to how their funding is allocated, or to other community advocates who are wanting to connect with funders in their communities to try to address these issues?
I think two of the key things I would bring up, and some of this is probably showing on the slides, right? I think we have found that even some of our partners who really do want to be low barrier aren't great at writing low barrier tenant selection plans. So I think if you are a funder or a technical assistance provider who is promoting low barrier, I think creating template documents with kind of pre-approved language, and then for us, we review and approve all these tenant selection plans. It's really important, and a lot of times we just find that someone maybe took a legal template they were given from another property or something and tried to change a few things, but there's still high barrier things hidden throughout there. So for us, I think the importance of providing templates and doing ongoing reviews of tenant selection plans to make sure they're still correct is important, because again, I think we found even well-intentioned partners sometimes struggle to write a plan that's going to incorporate all of these policies. And then we've talked about it a little bit, but I think, one of the most constant obstacles or lessons learned I think we have seen is that people sometimes, I think, have the wrong fear about where they're going to fall out of compliance with fair housing. And so we've learned, I think, to get more out in front with very affirmatively saying, this is not going to be a fair housing concern, right? Because when we don't say that, we inevitably have people come back to us and say, well, I've been looking through this and I'm really concerned this isn't going to work well with fair housing. And what I mean by the wrong concern, right, is we hear people that believe, because they went to some fair housing training and what they think they heard was fair housing means I always have to treat everyone the exact same. And while there's some truth to that, if you say, well, the way I treat everyone the same is I just deny everyone at my property who has any type of criminal history, we're actually setting ourselves up for a potential fair housing violation based on a disparate impact on certain classes. And so the way we treat everyone equal isn't denying everyone, it's doing that individualized assessment and making a case-by-case determination. And that's not a new concept under fair housing. We've always done that for reasonable accommodations and modifications, right? Someone requests something that is unique to them, and we determine based on their disability if they need that. So we approve unique policies, unique physical modifications for individual people so that they can enjoy housing. And so I think it's framing this the same way, that it's not that different than an accommodation or modification. It's a case-by-case determination of how do we get this person housed.
Yeah, I want to reiterate Matt's first point, and I think the second point is really important too. But I think the first point is just so important that you have some structure in place to guarantee that the tenant selection plans and policies say kind of what you want them to say or what they're intended to say. So often I'll read a tenant selection plan and say, okay, well, what about, so wait, you're screening people out for this. And then somebody will say, well, no, we're not doing that. I say, but that's not what your plan says.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't, not everybody's great at thinking through how these policies work and being really specific. So having some kind of mechanism in place. We do a review and approval process. I think that's been very useful, and I would recommend that. It can be, a lot of extra, burden on a funder, I guess. So if that's not something that's viable, at least having some template language that's required, or something like that to set those policies in stone and make sure that there's no wiggle room, because you also have so much turnover on properties, and you don't want, when a new staff person comes in, they're not going to understand, necessarily what their requirements are or what that policy is intended to say, and then interpret it in a totally different way. And you don't want that to happen. I would also say for on the other side, on not thinking from a funder, but if you want to see this work in your community and want your funders to be more involved, don't assume that they know that this is an issue that they need to be involved in. I think just approach funders and ask, like, what are you doing about this? Is this something you've considered? And have that conversation goes a long way. I mean, we've, it happens all the time where somebody will come and ask us if we've, considered doing something, or why aren't we doing this or that? And it's, well, I didn't know about it. Like, what do we need to do to, to make that better? So, at least in our position, we want to be, very open to community needs, and of course, like advancing affordable housing in the state. And I think, every other HFA is in that same position. So, I think it's up to the community sometimes to communicate what those needs are to make sure that everybody's aware and knows how they can be involved.
And I think to piggyback on that, it's about coming together around our common mission and our common goals, but listening to each other. We need to know what those are, and then understanding and identifying how do we get there. And so I think that's a big piece, is sometimes we need to take that time and slow down, and really do communicate and understand this doesn't happen overnight. And sometimes it helps to have a little bit of a hammer, but we also need tools besides that to really make this work meaningful and push forward. And so having multiple opportunities for how we provide information and education across different partners. We know data is important and outcomes. So some people that resonates for them, for others, what resonates is a real life story and connection. So what is it for those different entities that makes the difference? And I think the other thing that's really key, and it's been brought up by other colleagues today, is this is about folks being able to access the housing that's needed. And I see some different things in the chat and the Q&A. It doesn't stop there. It's also about having the services that are connected with our properties, whether it's supportive housing, but even within our affordable housing. We need to have those robust services, and we need to have the funding to support that, so that folks do have that opportunity to thrive. And so I just really want to elevate that while this webinar is not about services directly, it's really key that we don't stop here as folks enter at housing, and we are removing those barriers for accessing and getting into housing, but we also need all those robust services to continue to remove barriers and break those systems.
Thank you for that, Leah. And we're going to move into a time of question and answers. So go ahead and put those questions in the Q&A box as you're able. And just want to, as you're doing that, want to highlight a couple of things that were just said. I really appreciate this sort of, the vision behind the work you're doing is because it is the right thing to do. The data supports it. It's an evidence-based practice. And then that idea of like, if not us, who's going to do it? Like kind of owning the position you're in. And that's something that I think I can encourage everyone in the audience today to think of, like, what is the position that you are in as, your agency or where you sit in your community, and think like, really encourage you to reflect on like, what's the role I can have in this space? What is within my scope, and who can I partner with to try to address these issues from my point of view? We tried to communicate to you all a couple different techniques that you could use, but maybe it's something totally different that you have thought of in your community that you can be doing in this space to try to, chip away at the problem piece by piece. I also really appreciate that comment, Zach, of like, don't assume that the people in your community, that the funders or the agencies in your region know about this. Like, have that open dialogue, communicate to them what it is that you're seeing in the community, because you are, many of you in the Zoom room today are the boots on the ground, and you need to be communicating. They need you to communicate up to them kind of what you're seeing. So really appreciate you all for being here and for everything you shared. And I'm going to invite kind of all our speakers to come back. And I'm going to try to get through. We have a bunch of questions. One that I see is this, I think, could be directed really at anybody. What kind of community pushback are folks seeing to this work? This is this question asker said, we see neighborhood associations panic when they hear about low barrier access to housing for previously homeless folks because they're worried about who will move in next to them. So kind of, I know this is a common thing that happens all across the country. So anyone have comments on how they respond to this kind of community pushback for low barrier screening? I can say that one thing that we've done in Virginia, one of the kind of, first of all, I want to direct you back to, I mentioned this kind of frequently asked questions document, and I'll put the link to that directly in the chat in a second, but it has a lot of data and research and language that you can use to push back against some of the concerns that come up. But I think one question I ask when I hear those concerns is try to dig at why. Try to uncover like what's behind some of that fear. So instead of responding to like this sort of blanket, I'm worried about who's going to live next to me, try to get at, well, why? Like, what's going on? Like, approach it with curiosity and really try to understand and hear the person, because they're communicating to you a very real fear that they have. But try and understand what's behind that fear, because it's likely that there's some misconceptions, maybe some stereotypes at best, that are behind those fears. And so trying to get at those, and then there's almost always data that you can use, or anecdotes, or whatever it is that might communicate to them things that will push back against those fears. So for example, there is no actual evidence that someone who has committed a crime in the past is going to commit a crime in the future, other than the data about unstable housing kind of being a driver for reoffending. So we don't actually have any real evidence that someone with a conviction record is going to be an unsafe neighbor. So, and that could be something that shakes people up a little bit, because it's something that's kind of goes against maybe what society or culture or conventional wisdom might tell us. So kind of just challenging some assumptions can be, I think, one tool in this conversation. That's a hard one. I'm curious if anyone else has comments there.
I think those are spot on comments, and I don't know that this is a particularly helpful remark, because if that person's already in that fear, this might just make them really panic. But I think the reality is, and we've had this conversation with some people before, right, is the street you live on, the 10 houses on that street, you have no idea about the criminal history or the substance use of those individual homeowners on that street, right? You're not asking for every time someone sells a home to screen who's going to buy it, or assuming the bank is screening that as part of giving the mortgage. So why are we so concerned about these things? And it really comes down to, you have prejudices against low-income people and renters. And so I think sometimes calling out that there is, there are already people in the community living in other types of housing who have these types of backgrounds. They're in the neighborhood. You don't even know they're there. Why would these individuals cause any more problems than them?
Thanks for that. Appreciate that. And I think a good reminder.
I know this is probably a given, but I think making the assumption that you're going to get this in community and developing a really intentional community engagement plan. So, I've seen neighbors become aware of a project when it's in the newspaper, probably not a good idea. And so really thinking about, and someone said this in the chat as well, working with neighbors to create, like, what does a good neighbor look like? How do we work together if things are going to come up? Because they are. And so how do we, if you see things, who do you call as a neighbor? And how do we create a space that's for all of us? And so I think helping, like, working with neighbors to work through some of those fears, and then what does working as good neighbors look like, and how do we kind of address some of the things that are naturally going to come up, and plan really early on.
Thank you both. There's a few questions in the chat that Leah kind of alluded to already, but I'll lift them up and see if anyone else has responses. And these questions are all kind of similar and related to this question of, okay, so we provide home, we lower our barriers, invite people into housing, but then maybe there's behavioral problems. Maybe there's active drug use in the property. Maybe there is destruction of the property. Like, what happens when like those fears come true and someone does violate the terms of their lease? Kind of where are we left with now? And I heard Leah talk about the importance of supportive services in addition to housing to try to mitigate some of the effects of that, but wanted to hear if there's more on that.
One of the things that I've seen recently that I think has been really helpful is being really clear with tenants on what's allowed and what's not allowed. And so I've seen like harm reduction addendums that explain you can't use substances in common spaces, hallways, outside the property. You can't be selling within the building, but like within your unit, it's okay. And so, explaining we're trying to create an alignment with Housing First, a commitment to harm reduction. What does that look like? That you're asking people to not use alone. Again, that's very preventative. But I think by focusing on and making resources available for people early on as people are moving in, it can help alleviate some of those things that come up that you have to respond to immediately before it turns into, you know, something really big.
Thanks for that, Lindsay. Anyone else have anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just reiterate again that it's you know, we say this, that it's not you know, housing only, it's housing first, and that we can't set people up to provide housing without also providing those services, and then be frustrated that people do the things that we pointed and said, oh, see, we told you that would happen. And instead, we really need to be intentional about who we're working with and understanding the population. I always think that if we're a team of property managers and service providers, developers who come together to say we want to provide supportive housing, then we've made this choice. Therefore, it's incumbent upon us to work together to provide high quality, evidence-based supportive housing and housing first. And that includes the services. And it's, yeah, it's tough, challenging, and rewarding work. But being able to say we're using the model and the evidence is what we have committed to doing.
Yeah, and I think using all of the resources at your disposal. So as a landlord or property manager, you know, building a strong relationship with the services providers so you can be coordinating and kind of coming together to support a tenant, looking at community resources available to you as well. Also, I think trying to decouple the, as several have said, separate the behavior with the population, because I know I've had some pretty bad neighbors out there, and that had nothing to do with supportive housing or low income communities or anything of these things that we're worried about, right? So I think recognizing that to some extent, being a landlord, there's going to be some tenants that are not following the lease, and so kind of again using all the resources at your disposal to try to support a person. I'm looking through the questions that we have. So there's a question about insurance providers. So this is a question kind of what it would be great to understand the balance between what a insurance provider says the requirements for tenancy versus what a community or population specific building may prefer. And I think this question can kind of be extended to not just insurance providers, but like other funders, other like community rules. Kind of how do you balance your values and what maybe you want to do in a building versus external requirements that might be imposed? Anyone have a response there?
Yeah, this came up recently in our state, and I think it's an important question because you know, the funders hold the purse strings, and if we want to be able to get access to these resources, we've got to be in compliance. But what I find is a lot of our properties were not doing the bare minimum of what's required, but would sort of stack the deck in addition to and add additional barriers. So I think what's important is to sort of understand like what is the bare minimum of what we need to do to be in compliance with the insurance, with the funder, and kind of understand that maybe even have a matrix of like all of sort of the policies based on the stack of our different fund sources and our different funding requirements, and understand what is it that we have to do in order to be in compliance, and what is it that we're adding on that may go against our values, may go against what's maybe creating more harm in our communities, and have a very specific conversation instead of just making blanket policy.
Anyone else have a comment on that?
I don't know about insurance specifically. I haven't heard that be a concern, but I'll just say that, when all of our policy, like we structure everything so that if there's a like legal requirement or a like programmatic requirement that you not admit somebody with a certain type of conviction or background, then that is obviously not like part of our policy, and that's is an exception to the policies that we have for low barrier. So, if somebody is on the sex offender registry, sometimes they can't live within, certain distance of like a school or playground. And, if that's the case, then there's really nothing we can do about that. And obviously it's a law. So, those things are just exceptions or a separate part of the screening.
Mhm.
Great. And then
Yes,
upon other, oh, please go
Oh,
ahead.
yeah, I was just gonna say, I'm not aware of anyone that's come to us and said that, hey, I can't implement your low barrier screening requirements or scoring because of insurance. I think they are making those commitments up front to us and then going and shopping for insurance that will allow it, right?
Right.
So we have lots of properties using these either voluntarily or mandated by us, and they are insured. They are finding investors to buy those tax credits. So this is definitely happening in Indiana. The properties are funded, invested, insured. And we do know that sometimes there are additional costs affiliated with supportive housing and some of these other things that we incentivize. So I don't know for sure if maybe some of them are paying a slightly higher insurance premium. Often, sometimes that may be offset just by some of the funding and benefits they're getting from us. In some cases, we would allow higher reserves depending on some of these types of requirements being implemented. But yeah, we have not seen in our 16 years of doing this anyone who says I can't get a property insured because I'm following your policies.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's really helpful. We're coming to the end of our time. There's a question here about, will the recording be shared? Absolutely. We are recording this session. And so it will be available, I think will be sent out to all registrants, and it will be housed on the CSH website for the future if you want to share it with folks. But just want to thank everyone for being here, for taking your time to be with us. And thank you so much to all of our speakers for sharing your wisdom with us. I'm looking forward to hearing more about what folks in the community are doing around this space and what they will be continued to do as a result of this. So Kanani, did you have anything else you wanted to share as we close?
No, nothing. Just look out for a follow-up email with some of these things attached to it in the next several weeks. Yeah. Thank you all.
Thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you so much.